Very good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on managing employee activism. My name is Charlie Howard and I'll be chairing today's discussion. Just before we kick things off, we'll wait a moment while people join the event and then we'll get started. So we'll just pause for about 30 to 60 seconds. Just as we're waiting, where are we joining from today? Jack, whereabouts are you joining us from today?
I'm calling from London, where, very sadly, very grey down where I am in South London.
Excellent. And what about you, Rachel?
In central London, equally sad and grey. I worry this is where we're headed for winter, sadly.
Indeed, and I'm joining from Camden in London too. But wherever you are joining from across the UK, I hope that the weather is a bit drier today than it was yesterday. So I think most people have probably joined by now. So we'll kick things off without further ado. So once again, a very warm welcome to today's webinar on managing employee activism. We're joined by Jack Myers from Alder and are delighted to welcome our guest contributor, Rachel Mathieson, a partner at Bates Wells, a leading law firm in the charity sector. So if our speakers could perhaps introduce themselves a little bit further at the outset, if we could start with you, please, Rachel.
Charlie, yeah, so I'm a partner in the employment team at Bates Wells, and as Charlie has kindly said, we're a firm that specialises in the charity law sector. So we're very used to working with charities on issues of this nature. So I will obviously today speak from an employment law perspective, and I will touch on some of the charity law issues. But if there are charity law questions, please do bear with me. I'm unlikely to be able to comprehensively answer, but obviously can take them away and discuss with charity colleagues.
Thank you, Rachel. And Jack, if you could briefly introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. And my name's Jack. I'm one of the directors here at Alder. Alder is a crisis communications consultancy. So unlike a normal PR outfit, we only deal with clients who are on the back foot for whatever reason. Our charity practice is quite substantial, and we're dealing with all manner of issues, whether that's regulatory, legal, criminal matters, workplace culture issues, behavioural issues. And when we advise clients, generally it's providing senior leaders and trustees with strategic support when they're on the back foot. So yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jack. So just before we kick things off, I'll just share a few house rules to run through before we open up the discussion. You should see at the bottom of your screen an icon for the Q&A function. If you have any questions or observations for our speakers during the chat, do submit them in the Q&A box. I'll share them with our speakers during our discussion, during a short Q&A at the end of the discussion. Just to note as well that the session will be recorded. So just to outline the structure of the session, we will start with our panel discussion. This will take about 25 minutes and will include a scenario, and our speakers will give an expert viewpoint on the scenario. We will then have a short Q&A from the floor. If we don't get to your question during the discussion, don't panic, as we will be in contact following the webinar with a full white paper, as well as our team's contact details. So Sarah, if we could have slide one, please. Just to set the scene at the outset, it might be useful to set out what we mean by employee activism. Employee activism is when employees call on leadership to take action on social, cultural, or political issues. Often these calls for action are framed as demands for accountability or solidarity and involve criticism for inaction to date. Employee activism can be a useful vehicle for organisational change, and there are issues that leaders should expect to have to negotiate on, such as industrial relations and workplace culture concerns. Indeed, issues raised by movements such as #MeToo and Black Lives Matter have often only received serious attention as a result of concerns raised by employees. However, challenges can arise when employees make demands, i.e. when employees expect the charity to make public statements about matters that are outside the charity's core mission, that senior leadership cannot deliver on without exposing their charity to serious legal or regulatory risk. Charities are uniquely vulnerable to the risks of employee activism, not only because of their legal and regulatory obligations, but also arguably because of the high levels of social and political engagement of many employees in the third sector. Employee activist demands can escalate quickly, making it essential that leaders examine their vulnerabilities and consider what mitigation might be worth implementing before demands are made. So today we're going to be looking at employee activism through both a legal lens as well as a PR and reputational lens. So without further ado, let's go into the panel discussion. If I could perhaps start with a question for you first, Jack, and that is, why has there been this rise in employee activism in the charity sector?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. So just by way of a bit of background, Alder has researched quite considerably this topic of employee activism over a number of months. The product being a white paper, which I think we'll be sharing after this webinar. But as part of that research, we spoke to charity leaders across the United Kingdom. And one of the most surprising figures that came out of that research is on the screen now. It's the fact that when charity leaders come to us for advice, often they feel very lonely, that they're the only ones facing the storm. But in actual fact, most charity leaders in the UK have faced some sort of employee activism over the past 2 years. If I just take the question really broadly to start off with, I think there are a number of reasons why employee activism, as we've seen a rise in employee activism in the charity sector. I think one key reason is just simply political consciousness. So many employees in the third sector are very politically engaged themselves. They bring experience from either being party political members, their trade union movement, or campaigns in which solidarity plays a key crucial part. Because of that, I think employees increasingly expect charities to reflect their values, whether that be on social justice, environmental sustainability, or ultimately political alignment. So that's one thing. I think a second really important point is just the structures of charities, really. So I think over the past few years, the demand for greater transparency and accountability has grown across all sectors. But this is often manifested as a demand from employees within the charitable sector for greater detail on trustee or leadership decision making, as well, and that has manifested things like increases in subject access requests, in some cases FOI requests. So very high expectations of transparency from leadership, and attached to that is also just the way charities are structured generally. Many charities pride themselves on being very non-hierarchical. And when it comes to employee activism, that can raise employee expectations of what information and action they can reasonably demand of senior leadership. So I think as factors, I think those would be the principal ones that we've seen over the past few months.
Thank you. Rachel, what about from your perspective? Why has there been this rise in employee activism in the charity sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of factors. Really interested in your point there, Jack, on the lack of hierarchy, because obviously that's quite double-edged, isn't it? It's great because it gives everyone a voice, but then it can lead to difficulty. But in my practice, I act for a whole range of clients, including in the non-charitable sector, and it's always struck me that charities are generally held to a considerably higher standard than non-charities by their workforce. And obviously this is hardly surprising, given people who choose to work for charities are often motivated and engaged on particular issues. And given that the nature of a charitable organisation is that it is there ultimately for the public benefit, but that can lead to a wider expectation that's applicable to everything rather than just the charitable purposes. So I think that's one factor. I also think it's just a sign of the times, with the sort of huge rise in social media and technology. There's a growing expectation that individuals and organisations should take a stand and express a view on what can often be very polarising and divisive issues. And organisations in the private sector are actively increasingly doing so. So for a number of reasons, either because it aligns with their values to do so, and they're not limited in the same ways as charities are, as we'll come on to, or more cynically, sometimes there may be commercial pressures to make a stand on certain issues. I think that's also relevant. And then from an internal employee perspective, coupled with the sort of external world of social media, there's also the internal use of electronic tools and workplace social media platforms. So I've recently heard about Yammer, which is an equivalent tool to Facebook for colleagues, apparently. And then there's MS Teams and Slack and other examples. And these tools can be a way for a sort of a movement to gain collective traction and strength very quickly in a way that would be much more difficult before.
Great, thank you. So Rachel, how does employee activism cause legal problems for charities in particular, would you say?
So two immediate angles for charities to consider from a legal perspective. Firstly, the charity law regulation side, recognising I'm not a charity lawyer. But the cornerstone of charity law is that charities must further their purposes. And charities can legitimately engage in political activities which support their purposes, but that has to be in the best interests of the charity to do so. And the definition of political activity is an activity which is aimed at securing or opposing any change in the law or in the policy or decisions of central government, local authorities, or other public bodies, whether in this country or abroad. So it's quite wide. So even if a charity can establish it's in the best interest to engage in political activities, charities can't simply exclusively politically campaign, and they also can't take a party political stance. So that's really important in the political arena. A charity needs to stress its independence and ensure that any involvement it has with political parties is balanced. There also needs to be key consideration that whether campaigning is an appropriate use of a charity's assets and a charity's resources, and ensure that the risk of any negative reputational impact can be justified and has clearly been considered and thought through by the trustees in advance of any such statement. If trustees could be in breach of charity law if they spent funds and resources on activities which didn't further their purposes, or they took a party political stance, or they undertook activity which seriously damaged their reputation without the prior justification. And the Commission could open a formal or informal regulatory inquiry and even suspend trustees from acting as a charity trustee in the future. If the Commission does look to investigate, it typically will look for evidence that the trustees have considered those consequences of any campaigning activity and have sensibly determined that with a clear rationale that it is in the charity's best interest to do so, to take a stance. There's obviously also even if the Commission investigates and clears a charity, there can still be media attention and reputational damage. So that's sort of the first thing to consider as a charity, whether it's legitimate and within your purpose to be acting in this way. Then from the employment perspective, there's obviously inevitably going to be employment law consequences. So even where you've taken a decision not to make an official statement because you don't think it meets the threshold of what I just discussed, you're still going to be left to deal with managing the employment law implications of statements that have been made internally. And an often difficult issue is a risk of managing competing protected beliefs and striking that balance. So you might well have an open letter signed by 150 staff, but if you have 5 staff with a different view, you need to think about how to balance one employee's right to manifest their beliefs or freedom of expression with the protection and rights and freedoms of others. And if not handled correctly, there's obviously a risk of an employee raising a grievance, harassment, discrimination, bullying, and that can be on either side, the employee activists or other individuals who are affected by the statements made by the activists. And obviously this could lead to litigation, which is obviously ideally avoided by all organisations. So yeah, I think they're the key issues there.
Thank you very much indeed, Rachel. And Jack, perhaps for you, I mean, it brings us on to a question actually that was asked in the Q&A box about how do we manage conflicts between colleague groups due to activism, and also managing requests from employees to be more activist than the board is comfortable with. How would you advise managing these conflicts, between colleague groups from an internal communications perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think emerges from everything that Rachel's just said is that one of the kind of core issues with employee activism is actually a point of like legal literacy, people being able to understand what is ultimately a very complex regulation and legal landscape. And I think it can be very difficult for employees in the charitable sector, particularly when a lot of them are engaged, when they are engaged in legislation, it's on the campaigning and lobbying side. I think it can be very difficult for them to just grasp the restrictions that they're placed under because of various laws and regulations. So I think that's kind of a critical point that undercuts a lot of the employee activism in the sector. But yeah, sorry, to your question, yes, it's incredibly difficult to mediate kind of competing loud groups within an organization. And obviously, there are kind of structural difficulties, particularly when senior leadership are pitted against a board. That can also be very difficult to mediate. I think one general strategic point that I would draw out is making sure you have canaries in the mine and your ear close to the ground, because with any of these issues regarding employee activism, very rarely do they arise out of nowhere. Often you'll have a lot of frustration bubbling over a period of time, and it's being attuned to those signals and being able to confront them and having the hard, tough conversations early on that will mean that you're able to avoid far more legally thorny issues later down the line.
Thank you. And Jack, perhaps a further question for you. I wonder if you could sort of paint a picture and bring to life, what does employee activism look like in effect?
Yes, sure. So again, I'm going to maybe cast just a slightly wider net, because I think it's interesting to look at the issues that actually concern charity leaders. So could we get the next slide up, please? So as part of our research for our white paper, we asked charity leaders where they felt most vulnerable in terms of reputational risk. And I think some of the results, you might expect, but some of them are quite surprising. So if we could move on to the next slide. So this is percentage-wise of the sorts of issues that charity leaders said they felt most vulnerable about. Now, at the top, you can see issues that actually, not too surprising. Most leaders would, sensibly be quite concerned about regulatory scrutiny and litigation. But there are some issues there that I think are surprising. So in particular, positioning on international conflicts, as well as stakeholder complaints and employment disputes, as well as trade union disputes, figure very highly in terms of what charity leaders are concerned about. And I think what this really reflects is just the immense volatility in the sector. So leaders are anticipating conflict when they're looking at their vulnerabilities. And a lot of these actually anticipate a political conflict, or a conflict with a slightly political or a kind of confrontational flavor. So I think one of the things to be kind of attuned to then is just the political dimension that many of these issues have. So in terms of what that kind of means in terms of what employee activism looks like, because of the nature of their work, charities generally have a culture of open discussion and sharing political values, and having particularly having discussions about how politics intersects with the charity's objects. And indeed, many employees in the third sector will actually demonstrate a lot of active engagement in political campaigns that are close to their heart in their own free time. So the highly politicized employment base there. So unfortunately, what that means is that many charity employees confuse political activity in service of their charity's objects with political activity in general. And it's when that confusion isn't addressed robustly at an early stage that pressure builds. So the first sign of pressure, as I mentioned earlier on, is probably some form of direct question to senior leadership or to someone's line manager. I mean, in particular, when direct questions are asked in a forum setting rather than, a discrete one-to-one or through a charity's normal process, I think that's a bit of a red flag. And these questions they could come from a number of different directions. But often when it comes to activism, the question will be asking, what is senior leadership doing on issue X? What is the board? How's the board made a decision on issue Y? What is the board planning to say about issue Z? That indicates increasing tension and expectation within the staff base. How that evolves depends on how the charity leadership confront those questions at an early stage, but they can escalate incredibly quickly. And the next natural step is for questions to be asked in some sort of public statement, whether that's an open letter or whether that's employees turning to their personal social media to talk about a charity's position or demanding action. A more formalized way of that appearing is a petition. So that brings in a larger group of people. It brings in your stakeholders. It may be shared with donors, funding bodies, partner organizations. So again, it just increases the pressure on the organization leadership as a whole, having to answer to that. And then ultimately, where employee activism in the kind of worst case scenario leads is some form of direct action. So that could be protests, it could be a walkout. Sometimes that will bring with it kind of trade union elements, but generally speaking, actually, trade unions are very good in giving their members a steer on legal and regulatory frameworks. Once you have public displays like that, you're at risk of increased media attention. So a lot of our work that we do is helping charities manage media approaches. But once should fundamentally be a stakeholder issue or dispute, once it's out in the open, in the public domain, it then becomes a media issue. And that's where charity leaders really need to be most concerned. It's how you make sure those stakeholder issues don't become media issues.
Thank you very much indeed, Jack. So we'll now move on to a scenario, and we'll invite our experts to give their viewpoints on best reactions to this scenario. So if we could move on to the next slide, please, slide 5. I'll just share the scenario with our viewers. So the charity's mission relates to international humanitarianism. An employee collective has written an open letter to the board and senior leadership team demanding that the charity publicly censures the government for its stance on LGBTQ+ inclusion within the NHS. The employee collective threatens that if no action is taken, they will use their personal social media accounts and contacts in the local and trade press to criticize the charity for failing LGBTQ+ people. Meanwhile, an employee has used the charity's social media accounts to repost a solidarity statement from another humanitarian charity that criticizes the government. How should the leadership here respond? If we could perhaps start with you, Rachel.
Yeah, absolutely. So in a moment of crisis like this, the first thing to do is to step back and think about what exactly is being asked of the organisation and why. So here the employees are obviously asking leadership to engage in political campaigning because they want them to engage in activity with the aim of securing a change in policy of central government and public bodies. So this goes back exactly to what I was saying earlier on, that a charity can only do this if it would further their purposes and it's in the best interest of the charity to do so. The issue at hand doesn't sit neatly on the face of it within international humanitarianism purposes. So I'd struggle to see that this would be a legitimate use of the charity's resources. So the first step would be to reach that decision and to engage with the employees and explain this rationale and the predicament to them, being constructive, transparent, and opening a dialogue, and considering whether there's something internally that can be done that would support LGBT+ people within its purposes. At the same time, in terms of damage control, you should be warning employees that any actions which could damage the reputation of the charity may be treated as a disciplinary matter, but making sure that balance and any interference with the right to freedom of belief and expression is proportionate. And so in particular, you should be speaking to employees about improper use of the charity social media channels and doing this promptly to put them on early notice, because as Jack and Charlie have touched on, these things can escalate very quickly. So making sure that's all in place and signposting to the social media policy. In respect of the post that's already been made by the employee, then hopefully you should have that social media policy in place and follow that policy. So there should be a mechanism for taking that post down if it hasn't been put up following the due process, and then considering whether any proactive or anticipatory press releases need to be prepared. So getting in contact with Jack and Charlie here. The action is also likely, again, assuming you have a social media policy in place, is likely to constitute a breach of that policy because due process hasn't been followed. So this is likely to require you to invoke a disciplinary investigation for that employee who's reposted this on the charity's account. And then you'll also want to consider whether the reputation has been damaged of a charity, or whether there's a significant risk it will be, and therefore whether there's a need to file a preemptive serious incident report to the commission, or whether you just want to have all your ducks lined up and be ready to submit one. So perhaps signing up with your legal advisors in case things escalate.
Thank you. And Jack, how should the leadership here respond from a reputational point of view?
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. So I mean, I think a first critical point would be to say that you'd obviously want to engage your legal counsel immediately. I don't want Rachel being too humble here, but whilst there is obviously some very obvious crisis PR elements that your PR advisors could advise on here, PR should be deferring to your legal advisors throughout, given the number of issues that could arise. So I think the first issue I'd want to confront is the open letter. So obviously, the nature of an open letter, the complaint is now in the public domain. So there may need to be some firefighting that you need to do. But ultimately, what you're trying to do, as I mentioned earlier, is make what is become or likely to become a media issue into a stakeholder issue. So you want to internalize that conversation, as Rachel has already set out. Things you'll want to obviously anticipate are direct approaches from the media or stakeholders. So you'll want to be drafting, preparing yourself with draft communications fairly quickly off the mark here. I think another thing you'll also want to be very aware of is how the media might approach people and who they might approach. So it is likely here that trustees on the board are going to be approached, that members of SLT might be approached. And that could be, phone calls, email. In extremis, trustees do get approached by being doorstepped. So it'd be really important to prepare all those people for a potential media approach. I think another thing to also be aware of is how the media writes these stories. And an increasing trend that we've been seeing is what we describe as triangulation. So you may get a media approach very quickly once the open letter is out there, but actually might take some time. And that's not necessarily a good sign, because what journalists increasingly do is triangulate stories. So what they may do is they may approach campaigning bodies who take a similar stance as the open letter. They may approach politicians. And what they're doing there is they're getting all the groundwork for their story complete. They're getting quotes on the record from important decision makers. And the first you hear of the story, when it lands in your inbox on a Friday night with a very tight deadline, and you're confronted by an immense amount of research. So that's to say basically that just because you don't hear from journalists very quickly doesn't mean that you're out of the woods. And it's definitely an important and if not vital thing to be preparing yourself for a potential approach. The second thing I would want to say is just on social media accounts is just how you go about reminding people of social media policies and code of conducts, which may be breached with some of these actions. And it can be a very good idea to regularly send out soft reminders of social media policy if you think that employees may be vulnerable to misusing their accounts or blurring the lines between views shared in a personal capacity versus representing the charity as an employer. So I think, yeah, taken together, this is a very kind of complex issue, but definitely a number of things that you could be doing to mitigate the long-term media risk.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Jack. And just a very quick follow-up question for Rachel, if I may. Jack, you mentioned there about reminding employees of social media policies, etc. The question from the floor here is it acceptable to highlight in employees' induction where the boundaries lie, i.e. to tell them that we can't campaign on issues outside our core purpose? So can you share that at the initial induction stage?
That's a really good idea, actually, to have an induction. I mean, it wouldn't be solely focused on that, but perhaps a piece around charity governance and the field in which you're operating, because it's actually often quite stark how limited the information that is shared with staff on what the charity can and cannot do, and that huge misunderstanding and gap in expectations can then lead to this crisis which unravels and it's too late to do anything about. So I think having an induction session on governance generally which would cover that topic is a really good idea.
Great, thank you. So are there any legal developments, Rachel, that charity leaders should be aware of when it comes to employee activism?
Yeah, I think a few areas. So firstly, keeping an eye on the case law in terms of disputes around protected beliefs. You know, that there has been a lot in the courts over the past few years, particularly around gender critical beliefs and the Israel and Palestine conflict, and there are some key cases upcoming in this area. So it's constantly evolving, and it's moved away from whether something is protected as a philosophical belief, more about the manifestation of that. So there's a real fine line for organizations to take in when individuals, be it a group or a solo individual, starts making public statements that could cause offence to other individuals, and it's about whether that manifestation reaches that threshold for conduct issues. So it's a very difficult and fact-specific area, and like I said, it's going to be subject to change as cases develop in this area. So we're speaking to legal advisors on that. As a general point, Labour have said that they plan to introduce something known as a collective grievance process, which might be relevant here. So if a group of employee activists who don't feel heard, or a group of individuals who feel targeted by the activists, Labour have said that they're going to enable employees to collectively raise grievances about conduct in their place of work directly to ACAS. And that could inadvertently lead to the right to be represented by a trade union official, even in non-unionised workplaces. So obviously we'll wait to see how that actually unfolds with the Employment Rights Bill, but it's that would be a huge change, and it would be something at the same time as things going an open letter going to the media, also going to ACAS. It would be a lot to grapple with, so something to bear in mind. And then not new, but worth reminding, the Charity Commission guidance for charities on social media, which was published in September 2023, is definitely worth reading and following if you don't already do so. It sort of recaps the review against as to what's expected of charities, and you know, number one is that you should have a social media policy in place, so certainly worth looking at.
Great. Thank you. And is there anything that a charity could do or should be doing to mitigate the legal risks of employee activism?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a number of angles. So in terms of preventative measures, I think the question earlier, ensuring that employees are trained to some extent on charity law and regulation and the restrictions that charities are operating under. Having risk assessments to sort of anticipate issues like this arising, particularly if there is an issue going on in the public domain that may encourage or end up engaging certain issues or employees, or particular events that may give rise to collective action. It's important to have a risk assessment and understand what your sort of crisis plan is, and you may then, in light of the risk assessment, sort of proactively again highlight your social media policy, highlight the limitations your charity are acting under, and offering alternative support where applicable. Having that social media policy, as I've harped on about, but covering both angles in terms of employment related use. So covering things such as if you're contacted by a third party for comments, including in a publication or social media outlet, that the employees understand that they have to direct that inquiry as soon as possible to a named person within the charity, and that they cannot respond without their prior written approval, so that there's no blurred lines there. And also being clear in the policy that if you are resharing content, checking for the wider context, and particularly hashtags, whether that links particularly with a political party or a more controversial or divisive topic. And then on personal use of social media, this is always a bit more controversial as to whether it sort of impinges on people's personal life and freedom of expression. But ensuring that any employees who make statements on their social media policies are clear that they're speaking for themselves, and that they do not imply in any way that they're speaking on behalf of the charity. And obviously people in senior management roles within the charity must take particular care when expressing their personal views on personal social media accounts, because they're inextricably linked to particularly chief executive roles to the charity. So it's hard to separate their views from the charities once that's public. And then also reviewing wider policies such as bullying and harassment, code of conduct, equal opportunities policies and privacy policies, to make sure these are all in sync with one another and sort of anticipate collective and activism. And then in terms of reactive steps, so if these issues do arise, sort of triaging the issues that are raised. So where you can take a stance and you've determined as a board that this is in line with the charity's purposes, and it's in the best interest of a charity to do so, making sure that you then engage with the employees and any wider members on what exactly you'll be saying and how you'll be utilising your resources to do that. So not just sort of agreeing headline terms that we'll make a statement on this topic, because the detail of that will also be something that employees will want to say on. And where it's impermissible to act, because as we've discussed, it's beyond the purposes or it's otherwise not in the best interest of charity to do so, trying to diffuse that situation quickly and informally by explaining this to employees. So it's sort of a employee focused perspective, and also managing at the same time the external reputational risk by speaking to you guys and having that all lined up. And if there is a conflict between rights, such as between gender critical and gender affirmative beliefs, for example, it's really important to acknowledge both sides and remain neutral. And in many of the cases involving gender critical beliefs, the employer ended up publishing messages of support on one side, but didn't balance this with recognizing suffering on the other side. And that's where people come unstuck. So trying to remain neutral throughout. And then obviously if individuals are risk being isolated due to differences of opinions or otherwise impacted by the topic that's being discussed, then obviously making sure that they are aware of the support mechanisms that the charity has in place.
Thank you, Rachel. And Jack, over to you. Is there anything that a charity could do to mitigate the reputational risks of employee activism?
Yes, it certainly is. So again, a lot of the work that needs to be done, it goes hand in hand with the legal work. But I mean, ultimately, employee activism issues can be awful for senior leadership and boards to manage. They can lead to real breakdown in the cohesion within a charity, and that brings with it a massive kind of just psychological burden. Not to speak of the massive pressure it does to senior leadership's bandwidth to do their day-to-day job. So it is a test of leadership, and which is why it's so important for senior leaders to confront those issues as early as possible. It is down to senior leaders and boards to close the expectation gap between employees and charity leadership as employers before it becomes too wide to bridge. And that means leaders need to communicate with employees early the legal and the regulatory constraints that they act under as a charity. Obviously, at worst, frustration builds, and activist employees will brief the media and that may bring serious reputational challenges. So there are two things to say about that. One is to say that, you know, it's good to have an outlet for those sorts of internal frustrations. So having regular conversations or opportunities to raise those sorts of concerns so that things don't build internally. And the only way they come out is by briefing the press. But when the press are briefed, when a stakeholder issue has become a media issue, it's really important that charities are prepared for those media approaches that might lead to very negative coverage. Now, if we could just bring up the last slides, if that's possible. When we conducted our research, we asked charity leaders what they had in place were a crisis to occur. And if we move on to the next slide, we can see that charities unfortunately don't have a lot of crisis preparation in place. So whilst just over a third have a protocol to manage hostile media inquiries or media coverage, very few have a full crisis communications plan. Very few have the support they would need were a media inquiry to come out of hours or during public holidays. And these sorts of crisis preparation tools are going to be crucial when you're in the midst of a crisis. The worst time to be scrambling around making these preparations is when a crisis has already hit. So it's important for senior leaders to do what they can to protect the most precious resource in a crisis, which is their time, so that were a crisis to occur, they can devote their energies to the things that really matter, which in these cases are going to be managing those employee-employer dynamics really carefully.
Great, thank you very much, Jack. We've got about 4 minutes to go. So just following that discussion, we'll ask a couple of questions that have come in from the floor, if we may. So a question for Rachel: would it constitute gross misconduct for an employee to ignore a social media policy and publish statements or demands on controversial matters that aren't part of the charity's purpose? Would it constitute gross misconduct?
So obviously, as any lawyer would say, it would depend on the facts of the situation. But if you have been clear that the charity was not going to and was not able to make a statement on this topic, and then an individual used the social media platform to post something, then I think that would fit within the band of reasonable responses to determine that that's gross misconduct, obviously subject to going through a process and understanding the thinking of the employee. But yeah, I think that would. Whereas if it's more nuanced, the policy is old, no one really knows of its existence, and there's been no clear explanation, and it was sort of a misunderstanding, then obviously that's a different scenario.
Thank you. And one for Jack. How might a charity recover its reputation if employee activism or frustration and words have become public or gain media attention? How might a charity recover its reputation?
I think that's a really good question. And I don't want to cheat him and also say that it will depend on the circumstances, but I think there are a few general things that you could be considering. I mean, many charities already have it in place, but some of them don't. Media monitoring is quite critical when you're trying to gauge how the reputational damage in the face of hostile media coverage. If media coverage has come about because of some mischaracterization of a board decision or a senior leadership decision, then that you'll need to put in the work to try and put that right as soon as possible. That may lead to kind of negotiating with the media outlet directly. It may lead to some sort of legal action that you take against a paper or complaint, but you'll want to explore your options there. I think the other thing to just be aware of in terms of the media is, there may be a medium term, a long term to an employee activism issue. And you may at some point need to get your side across. So it's about being very careful about how you speak to the media and how you respond to inquiries. So often you would want kind of specialist advice, because what you don't want to be doing is fighting a fight on so many fronts, you know, on the employee front, on the media front, as well as other fronts. So yeah, I would always recommend you take specialist advice on those inquiries.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And then just a final question, if we may. And there's been one or two additional questions as well, but we will come to you separately after this, if that's okay, because just aware of time. The question is, I'm concerned about the risk of an employee raising a bullying or harassment claim based on the behaviour of other employees when there is a conflict between internal groups. Please could you comment on how this can best be managed? Rachel, I'm going to provide a brief overview of that. I appreciate that's probably quite a long answer, but if you may just briefly, bullying harassment claim based on the behaviour of other employees when there's a conflict between internal groups.
I mean, it's a legitimate concern and one that may well arise, and obviously the ordinary principles around dealing with that bullying and harassment complaint would apply, so investigating, etc. But in a sort of proactive way to try and avoid things getting to that stage, I think you may, either on certain topics or just as a general point, have set clear expectations with your staff around having a culture of tolerance for other views, and also respecting and understanding that people won't all share the same views and may be offended by views that they overhear. And this could fit neatly within a harassment training day. So you could cover what harassment constitutes, and a one-off comment can constitute harassment if it's related to a protected belief. So I think that would be how to grapple with it from a proactive perspective.
Thank you very much indeed. We've come to the end now of the webinar. I just wonder if any brief closing thoughts, starting perhaps with yourself, Jack.
Yes, of course. I think if I can part any key point, it's that preparation is key here, is that there's a lot that charities can be doing to brace themselves for a potential employee activism issue. I think employee activism speaks to just preparing charities for crises more generally. So I think it's really important to kind of incorporate it into your more general horizon scanning activities, but also having kind of full and frank conversations about employee activism issues at board and senior leadership level.
Thanks, Jack. And Rachel, over to you.
Yeah, I think a key point to highlight is actually a comment you made, Jack, earlier about that having a canary in the mine. These things don't come out of nowhere. You know, you don't have a completely happy, engaged workforce and something blows up overnight. There will be simmerings, and there will be unhappiness, and there will largely be distrust in the senior leadership because they don't think you're going to be doing the right thing, or they don't trust you to do the right thing. So it's about preventing you getting to that position, because once the open letter has been published, it's difficult it takes a lot of time and effort to repair the working relationship, and will probably involve some sort of cultural shift. So it's trying to avoid ever getting to that point.
Great, thank you. Thank you both very much indeed for that. And something I took away as well is, you know, having those plans and policies in place, but also effectively highlighting them and communicating them and engaging the workforce in those plans and policies. Just finally, you can find our speakers' contact details on the screen. So if you have any follow-up questions, then do contact them, and we will come back to any questions that we didn't get a chance to get to during the webinar. We'll be sharing a copy of our white paper in due course. That should be in your inboxes by tomorrow morning. And finally, just to say thank you very much indeed to our speakers for sharing their insights, and to yourself, to the audience, for attending today. And I hope you have a good rest of your Tuesday. Thank you very much indeed for joining.
Thank you. Oh, there you go.